Hello everyone, today we talk about Thessalian cavalry between the 8th and the mid-4th century BC. I already made a video that instead spans from the latter chronological end to the mid-2nd century BC. So in part we will be repeating some aspects of Thessalian warfare that fundamentally remain the same, because this region, together with Macedon, was fundamentally the only one in Greece to witness a stage of true cavalry supremacy. Right? Pliny deems the Thessalians to be the first in Greece to fight on horseback, then that is witnessed for the first time historically from the 8th century on, but naturally it was used before as well. You know that in the transition from bronze to Iron Age warfare, essentially horsemanship develops dramatically, substituting chariotry, and northern Greece was closer to the steppes military culture that were importantly influenced by the Thracians, the Scythians, as we will see now. And unlike in the south, where the free farmers fundamentally developed further through the polis, the preeminence of foot combat over the mounted one of the aristocracy, the requisite number of free farmers did not exist, since the Thessalian aristocracy, whose wealth was based on agricultural estates worked by dependent farmers, remained dominant, and so her cavalry. Pliny even states that this greater Thessalian equestrian culture had brought the local people to be called centaurs, right? Like the mythological figure of half man and half horse. And objectively, the vast grass highlands of Thessaly resulted the most fitting of all Greece for the livestock breeding and the reproduction of horses. Also the plains of Macedon and Boeotia, albeit more contained in dimension, served discreetly to the purpose, and in fact, not surprisingly, not just the Thessalian, but also notoriously the Macedonian and Theban cavalries always enjoyed this excellent fame, especially from the southern kind of Attican and Peloponnesian perspective, where in fact it was, as you know, the phalanx that dominated warfare. But even as we will see now later with some military examples, the latter fought in Thessaly, in other northern regions. The same terrain could make the difference, all considered, given that in part Hellenic cavalry has been somewhat overlooked because of the same political ideal that the Athenian, most Spartan citizenry was nurturing, given their particular urban environment. But cavalry forces, as we'll see now, also coming from Thessaly, for example, had always been siding the phalanx, and there were other also other troops, sometimes the same hoplites, were capable of fighting on horseback. And what we look at as the prototype of classical Hellenic phalangate warfare is essentially something just developing fully by the 5th to 4th century BC, and quite frankly, there is not really ever a perfect kind of phalanx battle. There's always something diverting from that model, and it was a model that was constantly changing, and that, as any military system, but however it maintained in especially modern culture this kind of splendid theory of itself for us sometimes to in a very Hellenic minded way, in fact, which we are heirs in many ways, to have kind of categorized as a kind of fixed system that as such did not quite exist, at least never to the full perfection, or not for actually even a very long amount of time. And Plato reminds us in his Laws that the manner of Hellenic fighting also in fact mirrored the physical landscape of Greece, Hellas herself. Flat plains such as those found in Thessaly and coastal Macedon, as we've seen, favored horse racing and the culture of cavalry, while in more mountainous areas, such as Aetolia, Acarnania, and Crete, the ideal enclave of herdsmen, skirmishing, and missile attack with javelins, slings, and bows were more the norm. As we will see, naturally, also Thessalian cavalry could perform like that. There was a wide range of cavalry consistency, let's say, on the field, from ultra-heavy cavalry to kind of lighter type. Let's say the more archaic the time, the less the difference, actually, because this cavalry, again, historically was quite primitive. It had just been born as an arm that could operate kind of independently, and in these lands even decisively, as we will see. And there were the exception, by the way, because these were quasi-feudal societies that did not exist in any other sedentary area of Europe, right? And this is why eventually Macedonian, Thessalian cavalry were essentially the most impacting, right? The heaviest that Europe ever produced. We could look also at Roman copies of the cataphracts in the East, but those remained kind of the product of a kind of statal reality and did not even perform particularly well, telling the truth. And so you have to wait fundamentally for the second modern age to be able to claim that, in order to have a strong cavalry, you can't do without a feudal society, right? This aspect is very, very important. But as we were saying, there were also lighter types of cavalry. In fact, if we look at the typical Thessalian cavalryman, he would be armed essentially with javelins and a long sword, the latter indicating the kind of important role of this horseman in close combat, right? And so with this tremendous capacity of coming to grips with the enemies and fighting, delivering this important blows from up to down, right? The same concept of the cavalry's, most cavalry swords, right? He wore usually no armor or helmet, right? But the typical Petasus Thessalian hat. And as with all the Hellenic horsemen, he didn't have saddle nor stirrups, merely the saddle cloth, or ephipion it was called, so that there was just this minimal barrier between the horse fur and the horseman's skin. But presumably most Thessalians always knew how to ride bareback, just like other kind of primitive Central and Eastern European military cultures of the North. Some note about the horse breeds now we will give, but in a broader sense, consider that cavalry had been injected in Europe by the Indo-European migrations, right? It had arrived as chariotry, but always naturally also as the spreading as a broader equestrian culture, from which, in fact, what we call as cavalry and per se would develop. And the Thessalians also were famous for some maneuvers that are somewhat typical of lighter cavalry, but not necessarily just so, that in a more developed sense pertain to the mobility of cavalry that we will see was probably the greatest at some point, that were the most mobile in Greece, developing important tactics that would open eventually to combined arms in the Macedonian tactics specifically. But the Thessalian trick of a feigned retreat, as is also used, for example, in the Phoenicides by Euripides. So that we're talking about the end of the 5th century BC, when Eteocles finally uses this trick, in fact, to kill Polyneikes. In the story, probably does refer to also some kind of skirmishing capacity, hit and run tactics, right? Consider that the Thracians just northeast carried out extensively this kind of tactics, especially the ones telling the truth on the left bank of the Danube, right? But still with important, spread of tactics also on the right bank and in the southern Balkans, up to Thessaly as well. So as I was saying, there was a gradual development. If you look at the, even just at the coinage of Macedonian kings like Alexander I, quite archaic times, you realize that, at least ideally, there was also a bit of heroic nudity involved for us not to understand exactly which degree of armoredness this horseman would have. I was just incidentally talking about the same thing about in the video about Athenian cavalry that I made recently, and the Athenians especially were kind of obsessed with this kind of physical perfection and purity, etc. But we know, as a matter of fact, just reading Xenophon, etc., that armor was there and is unfortunately not much documented iconographically. So just like in art, in figurative arts, you see this kind of ideal, just always bear in mind that Hellenic warfare historiographically is written, maybe in a less ideal sense, but still with an important bias that doesn't tell us too much, let's say, as it should, considering the importance of other elements, in fact, about cavalry, about skirmishers, that, however, we know were always there. There's a bit of this, actually, in all the Indo-European history. If you look at the even the Germanic sagas or the Roman ones, etc., you realize that, there is an ideal trying to, conceal for example, the importance of missile warfare was not considered particularly loyal, right? But if you look at the Iliad, you realize that the greatest killer in the story is an archer, as a matter of fact, even though it was kind of a more kind of hand-to-hand combat to prevail as the ideal of the hero, of the demigod, of those types. But these military cultures fundamentally all descend from that same ideal, in fact. And Thessalians were widely used as mercenary horse by the Hellenic states. And as we've seen also in the other video, in Hellenistic times, you could find them scattered by the Macedonian diaspora / conquest, let's say, of these various colonies that they had founded here and there. But they traveled as well across the sea. They'd surely find them in Egypt, in the Near East, etc. As you know, the Hellenistic world was pretty much dynamic in terms of also mercenary mobility and so on. In the years following the experience matured during the Persian Wars, among the Hellenic states, you can register an increased interest towards the creation of a more consistent cavalry force, as we have seen in the aforementioned video, in particular in Athens, where around 430 the contingent that counted 300 men was brought to 1,000 elements, and this decision was influenced also by the scarce political reliability of some allies, chiefly the Thessalians, to whom Athens had de facto, up to that point, subcontracted her own cavalry, right? And this aspect is quite relevant because aside from the Thessalian influence in Athenian warfare, Athenian equestrian warfare, there is also an increased need at this point towards the Peloponnesian War to maneuver more, right? Especially from the Athenian side, as Sparta mostly relied on its stronger phalanx, right? The Athenians, also because of skirmishing warfare, carrying out scorched earth strategy, etc., would need to outmaneuver the Spartans very often, right? So they couldn't just rely only on the Thessalian allies that were quite good, that were better than the Athenians on horseback, but they were still politically something else, right? So there is kind of a statalization of the army at that point. Just to make an example, in 458-57, the Thessalian cavalry in the Athenian army had defected to the Peloponnesians, effectively making the Athenians losing the campaign, because it could not operate without that cavalry, so that could not be tolerated anymore. And the same Athenian cavalry horses were imported from Macedon, Thessaly, also Corinth, Sicyon. There was an important, as you know, a connection also with Sicily that had an important equestrian culture. But let's say that Thessaly remained kind of the gold standard for a long time. Famously enough, we have 680 lead tablets that comprise part of the Athenian cavalry archives and date to the mid-4th, mid-3rd centuries. And among the 25 brands that appear on the tablets, it is known that the ox head, the Bucephalus, right, was associated with Thessaly, right? Hence the name also of Bucephalus of Alexander, that was a Thessalian horse. So also the horse of the king of Macedon, that surely didn't come from a country that lacked good horses, is on its own is quite an important mark of quality of the Saint Thessalian breeds. And in fact, the ox head type was mostly associated with Thessaly. It was to be found also Macedon. And probably the original heir was in the vicinity of Pharsalus, at least what the most important estates where they were bred were. Right? There was also the Centaur brand in Larissa. These were more or less. And thanks to Hellenic artistic sensitivity, we also can admire striking examples of accuracy. For example, in the appearance on the same coins of Larissa in Thessaly of a brood mare, showing also how in the mint administration the artists called to depict such images were aware of the different horse types with an important degree of zoological knowledge, right? And aside from just artistic talent. So it's fair to say that the Thessalian horses were the best in all Greece, right? Albeit, during the Persian Wars, they had shown to be inferior to the Achaemenid ones, right? And to the best horse the Persians could afford. I made, incidentally, a video about the Persian war horse that I also re-uploaded recently from the old one, and you can, check that out, and that, in fact, the best horses in the world were the heavenly ones that were imported in the same Achaemenid Empire from areas like Central Asia, and were used also by the Chinese imperial military, etc., because they were literally the best breeds ever for heavy cavalry. But not only. We are not informed exactly of which kind of how many types of horses existed completely. Let's say overall, we have an idea within these countries, but we know of competitions existing between these equestrian cultures. As a matter of fact, for example, just an example about the Thessalians. The first recorded victory in horse racing at the Olympic Games was achieved by a Thessalian, Crauxidas from Crannon, in 648. But Herodotus tells us that when the Persians arrived in Thessaly, that, as you know, most of Greece was de facto a client state of the Achaemenids since a long time, for not counting on properly the Hellenic polis in Asia Minor within properly Persian satrapies. Xerxes held a race for his own horses, right? Aware that the Thessalian horses were reputed to be the best in Greece. So when he arrives in the country, he says, okay, let's test them. And in fact, he included some of the Thessalians in the contest. And in the event, the local horses were left far behind, right, by the Persian ones. So it's not. This is the point what I was making before. It's not really clear whether this was intended to test the race horses, for example, or cavalry horses, nor properly what kind of types these were. Since the Hellenic collective noun that is used by Herodotus there is ehippos, right? That can mean, it's like horse in English. It can be both horses or cavalry. So whether this proves that the Achaemenid horses were on average faster than the Hellenic ones is also open to question, but there is no doubt that Herodotus takes for granted the existence of different varieties of horses at this time, which agrees with the artistic evidence, and that generally speaking, fits with the broader, say, hierarchic list of war horses, breeds, in terms of which one they were the most performing. And the reason why the Achaemenids had a superior cavalry to the Greeks, notoriously, is that not just they could draw from literally the best, as we've seen, breeds from the Eurasian steppes, where the top equestrian military cultures had always been, and from which the same Achaemenids were essentially Medians, they were Scythians, they had originated from. But also because when in fact these peoples had created the Persian Empire, sedentarized on an important, also urbanized, settled base, etc., they had began developing and I made a video on that too, on heavily armored cavalry that, however, was mostly like a sedentary one, created kind of artificially, like the aforementioned cataphracts, right? For the Romans, right? There were cataphracts in the steppes at this point. There were just something else. But say the typical heavily armored Achaemenid cavalry at this point is product more like of a sedentary, equestrian system that surely was heavily influenced by the steppe ones, by what the Achaemenids brought from the steppes, but that were something else, and that were ultra heavy. As a matter of fact, the Greeks didn't have any of that. So naturally, those breeds had to be the toughest. They were enormously expensive, by the way. Everybody knows the dramatic logistical efforts that the Persians made to invade Greece, etc. But we will keep talking about the Achaemenid army as well to understand better. I made a video about Xerxes' army order of battle as well, so if you're interested in counting cavalry, infantry ratio, etc., you can check that out. And there is something, however, in which the Thessalians and the Macedonians, at least in the 4th century, began to offer as a greater opportunity, for example, for penetrating enemy lines and wheeling about, than the Greeks and the Persians had been habituated to do, right? The latter would in fact usually employ the typical rectangular formation, right, in terms of cavalry alignment. Whereas the Thessalians and the Macedonians began to adopt the rhomboid and wedge-shaped formation that, as we know, would be integrated in effective combined armed tactics later on, which, in fact, nor the Hellenes nor the Achaemenids had been able to carry out, but it was simply a different time and a different space, right, and culture that we will partly address. And we still, I think we never talked about Macedonian cavalry, but, we will have to cover that. Important. But read Macedonian and know that there is a lot of Thessalian in that too. So famously enough, according to Elianus and Arrian, so we are in later times, but for ancient history and warfare in general, that's, it's even a lot to get in the first place. The Thessalians were the first people to organize cavalry in squadrons disposed in a rhombus shape, the rhomboedon in Greek, or of cuneus, which is a Latin term, but the Hellenists called embolon. And the rhombus, or lozenge, it's a formation that Aelianus attributes, in fact, specifically to the Thessalian tyrant Jason of Pherae, around 380 BC, which had the specific purpose of executing rapid movements around the enemy, right? And it had the advantage to be able to kind of switch direction by 45 degrees, at least immediately, without wheeling, in every moment, right, under the guide of the squadron leader, favoring through this form the ensuing penetration within the enemy lines. I made a video specifically talking about what this, exploitation of gaps actually meant. We're not talking about really very small surgical maneuvers in this regard. Even though these tactics are indeed recorded mostly in small scale, carried out by small units, but this could be done also by larger ones, albeit the difficulty there increases, and also partly the same need right on the field is not there. But definitely this shows not much the capacity of cavalry simply breaking an enemy line in a broader army phalanx, let's say, and simply making it crumble, right? The only thing that happened, and that I explained also in that video, is where, for example, a phalanx broke by itself, as it could happen very often. You see it even later on with the Romans at Pydna, but there are examples also from the time of Alexander in Greece. Well, at that point you can't make cavalry entering that, and so it's not as if you literally exploited a gap in the line, which normally is actually something suicidal to do, because it also kind of squeezes the formation further. So the fact that you have a rhombus formation doesn't mean you can fit everywhere, right? You still have to do with an important amount of space in order to maneuver again. So it's more than a gap there. It's just like in those occasions, like a chunk of phalanx that's somewhere and another that is another, right? And not the normal whole, because this is a very difficult thing to make people understand, as to many others, especially about technologism. This is not the case, but almost, right, in a wargamistic way, because people play video games and think things and do not quite understand what real warfare is really about, quite universally, by the way, not just in these times. But this formation still, however, shows the dynamism that this cavalry had, and the possibility of outmaneuvering, in fact, wheeling, quickly changing front, quickly having this kind of important flexibility that we will also see some examples of now in proper combat and other operations. In this maneuver, the commander, squadron leader, known as Ilarch, famously enough, was positioned at the head of the cuneus, and from the opposite side, given that this was a rhombus, so it was a specular formation, and from the other side of the base, let's say, of the same, the formation was closed by the head of the rear guard, the uragos. Rear guard closers are very important, because also they have to stamp eventual, fallbacks and this kind of things. While the two extremities on the sides of the rhombus were occupied by experienced horsemen, who were also had to be important for the same reasons, known as, in fact, plagiophylaces, that is to say, side flank guardians, right, defenders. The best horsemen also were disposed on the external lines, right, along, in fact, the line that united these 4 points, right, and they were the ones that naturally, just like in the phalanx, just like in the exterior, from depending on which direction you had to turn, this thing had, as we've seen, the capacity of changing direction. But those who had to do this were still the ones of the external perimeter, so were the ones that the other horsemen had to follow at the end of the day. So their order, their capacity, their was crucial. Naturally, we don't have to think this rhombus to be literally in every single battle, clash, etc., even formed, etc. But we know, and as we have seen in that Athenian cavalry video about the equestrian training, that these men were trained, and that was Athens. That was definitely not much of just per se an equestrian culture, but still had important cavalry forces, also citizen cavalry. Just consider the Thessalians and Macedonians that spent their entire time on horseback. Well, you know how precise they could be. They performed training maneuvers that were aimed at charging, you know, having 2 units charging at each other, and basically not smashing into each other by simply passing it with the columns one at the side of the other, right? And at full gallop. So we're talking about several tens of kilometers per hour. If you smash double that, because there is the other guy who comes from the other direction, you just, you know, you're dead, right? Or crippled forever, paralyzed. So if you knew how to perform that with that degree of order, and was done publicly with a huge deal of accuracy and risk, and also kind of impression you had to make, these people knew, like mostly the nobility that was obsessed with horses, as you know, in the European culture, even in this more sedentarized reality, definitely knew how to ride, right? And Xenophon, in fact, talks extensively about that. Again, the Athenian cavalry video is the one for you if you're interested in this. But again, we'll keep talking a lot about this. So the rhombus specifically was, it is said, was good only for small groups normally, and probably because of the broader difficulty, in fact, of maintaining the formation on terrain, right? Even if it were a suitable one, like a battlefield is not like a basketball field. You find any kind of possible thing, farms, fire, corpses. So the importance there, maintaining cohesion and control and vision and realizing what's going on, coordination. So all things that do not depend on how perfectly shaped geometrically the rhombus is. In the treaty of by Asclepiodatus, the rhombus is made up by 61 horsemen, with the positions assigned on the base of ranks and files, or staggered, in order to favor the compactness of the group as well. In this case, the horse of the following rank was disposed with the head aligned the withers of the anterior horse, and it is interesting to notice how through the second type of formation it is possible to create a group of 64 horsemen, that is to say, the exact number that constituted the basic unit, the ile, according to Arrian. And this type of formation was definitely better suited for say a more dynamic and aggressive tactics that contemplated properly the breaking of the enemy formation and the enemy line, and also properly a closer combat. The cunis that consisted, so the embolon that substantially consisted in a half rhombus, right, was the favored formation by the Scythians and eventually by the Thracians. And also Philip II of Macedon trained his cavalry with this formation that deployed on the external as the rhombus the best elements, making it more practical, however, of the rhombus, because it allowed to all the horsemen to constantly observe and promptly follow the movements of the squad leader. And as Asclepiodorus says, quote, as it happens in the crane's flight, right? So this formation was intended to be kind of more offensive, simply because it would maximize at that point the frontal attack and channeling the forces in the enemy in the breach, right, if they managed to break it in the first place. So this kind of formation was also suited properly to break, right? Not much to infiltrate per se, but meaning, you break through, and if you manage to break in that point, it's easy to generally speaking keep pouring, starting from that side of the break and making collapse the entire enemy line. So this has nothing to do with, let's say, entering an enemy formation, right, to divide it much per se, but literally breaking the line. This making the horsemen charge, right, and impacting at a different rate. Of course, the rectangular formation was used as well, so that in that sense you wanna try to break, to smash at the same time all along the enemy line in one blow, right? It depends on what you're searching for fundamentally. But remember that when breaking through the phalanx, which was charged against and routed, as we will see now, and especially in countries like Thessaly and Macedon, where again cavalry was often decisive, right, and infantry was weaker. The point is that, as you know, as the phalanx broke, normally in one section, like it broke in all the rest, right? So because it could be partly outflanked, but let's say having lost that cohesion was exposed to the enemy. So normally phalanxes would break when the right and left wing that was normally made up of cavalry collapsed. So the reason why the phalanx would give up is that they knew that they were too slow, and cavalry would simply outflank him as a major cavalry formation and attack them from the rear, right, with also an enemy infantry attacking from the front. So that's why they knew they were done for. Whereas these other formations were meant specifically to break the enemy formation, and so making it collapse at points and not much infiltrating the cavalry unit per se to do who knows what. Also because after a cavalry charge you have to reform in some way, unless you can afford in fact to just start chasing the enemy that is collapsing, right? At that point you will also kind of dissolve the formation. But again, it's not a matter of exploiting gaps per se, right? It's about creating some, which is another thing. It's just properly disintegrating the cohesion of the enemy line. We have interesting examples of Thessalians at work in this regard. For example, at the Battle of Cavalry, not the one of the Macedonian wars against the Romans, but the one of 364 BC. For example, Pelopidas, commander of Theban and Thessalian allied Thessalian forces, had fallen fighting against Alexander of Pherae, and his cavalry chased the entire enemy phalanx for a considerable distance, though, slaying more than 3,000, filling up the countryside with corpses. This Plutarch says. Even before, there are older examples. 511 BC, Spartans against Athens. This is the Thessalian allies, 1,000 cavalry under the commander of their king Cuneus of Conium, manages to overwhelm a Spartan detachment that presumably was of a few troops. In fact, the greater part of the Spartans arrived later and defeated the Thessalians, who lost 40 men. But just to say that again, a phalanx is not a magical formation that always allows you to simply withstand anything, right? And the consistency of a unit is based on the morale, and number is making a lot of effect in those terms. So of course there could be an infantry force could melt away against 1,000 Thessalians charging them, but a larger one could also rout the same. Just for saying it, habituating you at this concept that even though in ancient warfare infantry remains the so-called queen of battles for a long time, there were contexts where cavalry was decisive naturally. I mean, and the ones where infantry was weaker for some reason. Look at the steppes, right? Where less people properly even just fought on foot. There were, right? They were even trained and functionalized. Also later on, the ones that inhabited the frontier, the steppe frontier, would kind of functionalize to meet with those heavy cavalries, etc. And their light horse archers with combined arms. And the Balkans, in that sense, were a bit wilder. Were very good infantry forces as far as guerrilla was concerned, right? But they weren't quite states as we intend them. There weren't quite much of a unitary, middle class farming kind of peacefully developing organized force like you could eventually see, like in Greece, emerging as the phalanx, right? As we've seen here, we're essentially semi-feudal realities where the greater force was the ultra heavy and expansive cavalry forces with important retinues, and then all the peasantry kind of working line for them, right? So a very different model also for the kind of infantry, especially, that was recruited to eventually cope with cavalry, because of course also and in combined arms, like in the Macedonian tactics, reflect on the fact that the terrible Hellenistic Macedonian phalanx emerges from these lands that did have phalanxes. I mean, the various Thessalian Macedonian cities had their own hoplitic forces, right? Just they were weaker on average than cavalry forces than the southern Hellenes, right? So that's the point. But infantry, even though we're still talking about phalanxes, in the Macedonian phalanxes, it's something else, right? It's part of a combined arms tactics. It's not like a monad, like the classical Hellenic phalanx that at some point also needed to begin to provide itself with skirmishers, with cavalry as well, when they started making war on a bigger scale and on bigger theaters operation against different peoples. So that kind of phalanx we find just literally only in that way that we intend in Athens and in Sparta, right? Or even in their colonies elsewhere, the local phalanx was something else, and it integrated other type of troops, right? Just because their political and social background was different, and the peoples they fought were different, and the land, the territory, the ground was different, and so on, right? There's another episode in 454 where the Athenians tried to besiege Pharsalus. So we are in Thessaly. So at this point, Thessalian cavalry proved to be the decisive force, right? Because without fighting, even a battle, the Thessalian horsemen prevented the Athenians from controlling anything beyond the immediate vicinity of their camp. This is Thucydides telling us. And you understand that this phalanx, even an important one like the one the Athenians had, without cavalry support on a Thessalian terrain with this cavalry could not move, could not operate. That tells you how, specifically designed to operate in southern Greece, the classical Hellenic phalanx in many ways really was. At the 394 Battle of Coronea, fed up with the attacks on his rearguard, the Spartan king Agesilaus II sent most of his cavalry to the rear to challenge the Thessalian horsemen of the Theban, Athenian, etc. coalition that had moved against him. And due to the proximity of the hoplites, however, the Thessalian cavalry chose discretion and, wheeling about, retired in good order. Right, already telling us that they were, good at doing that, even in such, a dangerous position next to the enemy rear. So at that point, Agesilaus saw an opportunity to pass up. Right, he ordered his cavalry to attack the Thessalians before they could turn around and offer resistance, so that the Spartan king already knew what the Thessalians were capable of. And the surprise worked. The Thessalian cavalry commander, Polycarmus, together with his companions, did turn to meet the charge, so they were capable of changing front again and charging. That only very good, experienced, de facto professional cavalry units can do. However, they had the worst against the Spartans. So the remaining Thessalians simply fled. Right? Some were killed or captured by Agesilaus' cavalry in pursuit. So at this point, the Spartan king began to brag about his victory because he had bested the best horsemen in Greece, etc. And not that, however, the Spartans ever reached much, generally speaking. This is the cavalry standards of the Thessalians. The Thessalian cavalry, as you know, becomes famous in early Macedonian military reform, right? How they fit those, especially in the armies with which Alexander conquered Persia. However, at that point, they had already lost their independence and they were, in fact, serving a foreign power. In fact, we can date this at the end of the aforementioned Jason, the tyrant of Pherae, that, as we've seen, had suggested had introduced altogether the rhombus formation. So it's said he ruled between around 385 to 270 BC. In 369, Thessalian cavalry alone rendered useless the Theban phalanx that had invaded Thessaly, similarly to what we have already seen in the century before for the Athenian invasion. For 353, Diodorus says that Philip II of Macedon won against the Phocians of Onomarchus, as the Macedonian king's Thessalian cavalry were superior in numbers and valor. Then it's possible also that the 2,000 cavalry at whose head Alexander the Great, not yet so, but surely displaying these occasions, these forces, delivering the decisive charge at the Battle of Chaeronea, the famous one, were Thessalians, right? Not Macedonians, as a matter of fact, which we just don't know. Just they would have them in large numbers. Under, in fact, the same Alexander III, the mobility of the Thessalian cavalry at Issus proved a decisive superiority over the heavily armored Persian horse and rider. Some suggested that the ultra-heavy Achaemenid cavalry were not suited for close combat as well as this other lighter cavalry, paradoxically, because at that point it was mostly about maneuvering this enormously heavy cavalry as a block, right? And in order to smash anything they had found frontally, because everything in war is about collective training capacity. But in that sense, if you are not able to channel the charge against an enemy formation and there is somebody harassing you and carrying out this hit and run tactics to distress you, and you cannot run after them, etc., you may be at in fact a disadvantage against them. The Thessalian cavalry in the Macedonian army, here we are talking about later events than 350 BC for today's video's timeline, but in general, you know that they were second to the Macedonians in prestige, and probably they're equal in fighting ability as well. If you look at, today I didn't insert them, but as I was saying before, if you look at even Macedonian coinage, iconography, you can't not distinguish a Thessalian cavalryman from a Macedonian one. In Macedonian armies, they could be found on the left, but at some point they were deployed on the right as well. That was the most prestigious position, depending on the circumstances. The exceptional Thessalian courage was documented also in 322, again against the Greeks, etc. So in many ways we can say that the prominent role played by Thessalians in early Macedonian warfare can parallel in a way the one that the Campanian and other Italic allied hordes had for the Roman army, right, in the Romano-Italic Confederation. As there were very advanced military cultures, like the ones especially of Apulia, rather, that had also been influenced historically. As you know, those were, as Italics, some of them were Illyrians as well, so they came from a world was also kind of closer to the Equestrian Springs, etc. The Romans, contrarily to popular opinion, had actually a good cavalry, right? A strong one. They cared very much for it. It's just they preferred to rely on others. If it was better and cheap, and they could rely on it. At least for the Campanians, they had to see it when Hannibal invaded Italy that they couldn't rely on them, but it was an exceptional and unpredictable circumstance. But in general, but we will talk also about Italic cavalry at some point, because that's quite interesting and underrated as well. We could naturally tell a lot about lots of other things regarding Thessalian cavalry. Probably we will meet them again in some other video especially about ancient battles at different times. But let's say these first two introductions to kind of classical, kind of Persian wars kind of time, Thessalian cavalry, like this video and the other one in Hellenistic times, are served. And so for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.